Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today for what I know will be a riveting and very interesting discussion about workers' rights in Sri Lanka. Looking around the table, it's a lot of familiar faces, people that have been focused on the country for many years. As we all know, that it's not just the restoration of the political rights question that will deliver a peace dividend, but also the need for economic livelihoods to be secure for all in the post-war areas. We're really excited to have Tim Ryan here with us from the Solidarity Center to walk us through a report that they recently conducted on the rights of workers in post-war Sri Lanka, particularly focused on Jaffna, and with the expectation that this will give us a snapshot for what the circumstances look like in the rest of the North and East. This research really is an important contribution to helping us understand what the labor environment looks like. And as I went through the presentation, I was really interested to see what people's perceptions are in terms of their own labor rights. Tim Ryan, who is going to present for us today, is the Director of Asia Programs at the Solidarity Center, which is a core institute of the National Endowment for Democracy. We're proud to have supported the Solidarity Center in Sri Lanka for well over 20 years. Tim was also the field representative in Sri Lanka from 1993 to 1997, and then in Indonesia from 1997 to 2001. And it was there that he began his work, and the Solidarity's focused on issues of migration and anti-trafficking. He also serves on the board of the Global March Against Child Labor and on the steering committee of the National Writers Union, which has a chapter here in Washington, D.C. With that, I'd like to pass it off to Tim so he could walk us through the report.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mona, and thanks very much to the National Endowment for Democracy, not only for hosting the program today, but also the support for the Solidarity Center and for this report that we'll be talking about today. A word about this to begin with, before we get into some of the details. The situation, as everyone knows, in the north and east of the country remains somewhat unsettled. The effort here that the Solidarity Center and trade union activists made in Jaffna was really kind of an informal survey to try to get a feel for some of the basic issues, the big picture issues that are facing workers in the North and East, with the idea that eventually we'll sort of continue to collect this information and look at how it compares also both in terms of economic development and also labor rights and issues in comparison to the rest of the country. This study does not make a specific comparison between the North and East and the rest of the country, but there are some general lessons and I think some general trends that can be gleaned from that. The origins of the civil war that had raged in Sri Lanka for 26 years were always not just about political, but also about economic and social disenfranchisement of the Tamil minority by the Sinhala majority. Official language policy may have been the spark that started the fire, but the impact of a systemic marginalization in all sectors of society, of politics and the economy, that fueled Tamil grievances and the quest for a separate state was a major element of this. Now, with the end of the war in 2009, as many commentators have pointed out, the war, it's become a cliche. The war is over, but the conflict is not. one of the things I like to, it's sort of a crude analogy, one of the things I like to suggest, be it, somewhat critical of the, as I would say, the immediately previous Sri Lankan government, immediately after the war, was the analogy to the Marshall Plan in Versailles. It seemed like the Sri Lankan government had a choice between the Marshall Plan and Versailles after World War I, and they sort of picked Versailles. I think that is changing, and I think that there are opportunities not only for economic development in the North and East, but also for promotion of labor rights in the broader context of developing and reestablishing rule of law and human rights in Sri Lanka. Rebuilding Sri Lanka's economy, especially in the war-torn North and East, is paramount to the country not only to thrive politically, but economically and to mitigate current and future conflict. A key element to address conflict is equal treatment under the law. And there's rising concern that across a broad range of issues, this equality is yet to be realized. What we looked at in this report, this informal survey, we call it a snapshot of the some of the labor conditions in the North and East, was a look at labor conditions in the North and East, especially in Jaffna. One of the things I want to do to help set the stage for this, actually, is to talk a little bit about the changing demographics in the economy of Sri Lanka over the last 20 years, because they've actually been somewhat significant, and I think also point the way toward what kinds of economic opportunity and development might actually emerge in the North and East. So, as Mona mentioned, I had been the Solidarity Center representative in Sri Lanka between 1993 and 1997, so about 20 years ago, to pick two significant aspects of the economy in Sri Lanka. We can look at some significant changes in those areas. One was the promotion of manufacturing in the export processing zones in Sri Lanka, two of which near Colombo and one down south in Koggala on the southern coast. In the 90s and beginning 2000s, the peak sort of workforce in these zones, which manufactured extensively in garment, but not exclusively in the garment sector, was upwards of 300,000 workers. Today, the numbers of workers you find in a number of these zones estimated at around 85 to 90,000. There's been a decrease, significant decrease in the export processing zone manufacturing capability in Sri Lanka. Some of this is due to a variety of factors, but and it's also due in part to manufacturing that might be going on outside the zones. But that's a significant decrease in that particular workforce. It also points the way toward the idea that if, as some of the colleagues I know at the U.S. Trade Representative point out, that the export processing zone as a model has seen its day and is not really a viable sort of mechanism anymore, it's unlikely that the idea of establishing export processing zones, say in the North and East, is in the works or is a likely way to address economic development there. In fact, while there is some evidence of light manufacturing and garment manufacturing starting to move into the North and East, there are no plans that we're aware of that the government has any impulse to create these sort of similar zones as they did 20, 30 years ago in the southern part of the country. One of the other major income sources, foreign exchange for Sri Lanka over the years has been migration. This is an area where the demographics have really changed dramatically as well. 20 years ago, when we really started a lot of our work on migration in the Asia region, I was struck when I was based in Colombo that about 10% of the working population, the workforce, was out of the country at any given time. That's a significant number of people in relation to the overall workforce. But also, when we think about it politically, that's 10% of the population that's also disenfranchised. In other words, wouldn't have the right or opportunity to vote. All we have to do is look at the polls today here in the United States to see the seesaw back and forth between major parties to look at what a difference of 10% could actually make in the context of a country's election. At that time, about 60% of the migrant workers who were going abroad were women. Most of them domestic workers. And I'll say a little bit about that in the informal economy later. Today, Sri Lanka's migrant worker workforce now makes up about 15% of the workforce. So over the last 20 years, the number of migrant workers from Sri Lanka has actually grown, as the population. So the sheer numbers in general have gone up in at least two different aspects. And the majority now are actually male. They're not women. More of them for jobs like construction and semi-skilled and skilled professions, which is a whole different sort of demographic change, and also a different sort of profile of the kind of foreign exchange and the amount of foreign exchange that migrant workers were earning. One of the things that happened in the wake of the 2004 tsunami and there was a real sort of attention paid to this by the international community, was a concern about, with all of the disruption, with all of the displaced people and destruction of communities and so on, that not only migration but also trafficking might increase. And I believe there were statistics to suggest that that was the case. This is an interesting dynamic to think about in the context of how will economic development in the North and East proceed? Will there be the sufficient economic development in the North and East to accommodate the workforce there? Or is this going to be a situation where continued migration represents one of the more important aspects of people's economic choices when they look at trying to provide for their families and livelihood? One of the areas that is on the increase island-wide is tourism, hotel sector, and this is an area that certainly has been beginning to expand in the North and East, which there have always been tourism, obviously, in other parts of the country, but as a result of, in part because of the result of the war, it had been suppressed at times. It had gone sort of, up and down based on whatever security crises that might have been happening at the time. But this is definitely an area of increase, and it's an area that the Solidarity Center and its partners are looking at to find ways to improve worker rights and organizing of unions in that sector. So I just wanted to sort of set the stage a little bit and get to some of the basic findings of this informal survey that Solidarity Center and partners put together in Jaffna. This study, entitled Workers in Post-Civil War Jaffna, Snapshot of Working Conditions, Opportunities, and Inequalities in Northern Sri Lanka, really sort of highlights the challenge not only to providing opportunity to grow the economy, but also promoting basic labor rights that are essential to a well-functioning industrial relations system and a sense of equitable development. Our folks in the North and East, not only are they getting jobs, but are they finding ways to both A, protect their rights under the law, and B, are laws and standards being equitoply enforced in the region? So I wanted to run through real quickly some sort of basic overview findings of the study. I'm going to turn my back a little bit here to see what I'm looking at. We had, in terms of the methodology, About 2/3 of the total of the respondents to this were women. The overall, and this was a question, that we looked at in terms of who responded to the survey, and in many respects, the enumerators and the activists who actually collected the data from the trade union sector, the majority were women. I don't want to underestimate, this is kind of a sidebar here, I don't want to underestimate the concern that, both in the North and other parts of the country, especially, I would say, prior to January of 2015. Concerns by all kinds of people about freedom of expression, expressing their opinions in public. So I think that when I think there's a sort of a hangover effect of people's concern about willingness to express themselves and share information with surveyors in a lot of different parts of the country, but obviously the North and East would be included there. This is basically just a chart in terms of the respondents by age. About 50% in the ages of 20 to 29, so a lot of young people responded to this survey. Without going into lots of detail, you can see the breakdown here in terms of the basic sectors. There was a further breakdown in terms of jobs within each of these sectors. But as you can see, there's a fair amount of retail and as well as other formal sector work, factory, manufacturing, office work, some hotel and restaurant. But you can see, despite my comment about how tourism is one of the growth industries in Sri Lanka, at least in this survey, the amount of people who responded to the survey in the hotel restaurant sector were fairly low. There's also, of course, an important piece of the informal economy, domestic workers that responded to the survey. So we looked at several basic sorts of issues that are ostensibly enshrined in Sri Lanka labor law to try to get a general picture of the adherence to these legal regimes in the North and East, and particularly in Jaffna. One was do employees actually have a written contract? Do you have a piece of paper that says, this is what your job is, these are the working hours, these are the conditions, this is your salary? And we found that about 80% of the respondents said no, they did not have any sort of written contract. So in that regard, kind of operating at the mercy of the employer. Hopefully the employer has mercy. But what it does is it definitely sort of reveals a picture where workers are taking jobs, but they're in a kind of a sort of ill-defined gray area when it comes to their legal standing in these jobs. 85% of the workers were not aware that there's a legally stipulated minimum wage for their job. Now, the minimum wage picture in Sri Lanka is kind of complicated. Partly it's been a function of geography, and partly a function of particular jobs, garment industry jobs in the export processing zones, for example, under the Board of Investment would have had their own minimum wage. But there are different wage boards in different parts of the country that help set the wage in particular areas. In Jaffna, so there are about 43 of these things. However, that being a localized phenomenon, on one level you would think that people would be able to know and be concerned about what their wage is in their communities, with their neighbors, and so on. The minimum wage currently in Jaffna is 10,000 rupees a month, which is approximately 69 US dollars a month. But essentially, what we're seeing here is around 85% of folks aren't aware of what they really should be getting under the law. Whether they are or not is another question. We didn't get into that detail. But in this sense, people don't actually know what they should be earning in terms of the legal minimum. Not surprisingly, and I think we could probably use this graphic for every country in the world that we would want to do a survey of labor conditions. There's a disparity in the same jobs between men and women. Again, no surprise here. It's an issue we all need to work on. We need to work on in our own country for obvious reasons. Overtime is another question that it was important in this survey, in part because the number of workers who are actually working overtime, in addition, in not only just legal overtime, but actually beyond what the legal maximums for overtime are, we found to be relatively high. In this case, about 69%, 70% of the workers in their jobs were not entitled to overtime pay. And this is an ambiguity. This is why I would say this is sort of an informal survey. I have to go look back and look at some of the data to find out how many really knew whether they were entitled to overtime pay or not. The general level of awareness for workers across sectors of some of their basic rights, as we're seeing here, is low in some respects compared to some other sectors of the economy and other parts of the country. I don't have a chart for this one, but 83% of the workers work more than 5 days a week, and the greater majority of those working extra hours are women. So this question of overtime pay could become very important, especially if you're working more hours, than regular, and you may be working even more hours than you're supposed to under national law. In this case, this is, I think, an important slide in part because the EPF-ETF stands for Employee Provident Fund and Employee Trust Fund. Sri Lanka is somewhat unique in Asia for having had for a number of years at least a kind of a rudimentary social security system, the Employee Provident Fund and the Trust Fund, to which employers are obligated by law to contribute. This at least provides some kind of social safety net for workers when they are dismissed, they leave a job, they are retired. And in the context, this is one of those issues that workers all over, island-wide and unions island-wide, is a very, very key and measurable element of worker and labor standards that employers can be held to. And it's easy to check with the Ministry of Labor and the government ministries that are in charge of administering this fund. Is my employer actually paying into the fund for me as they are obligated to under the law? As you can see in this graphic, about 70% of the employers for the workers surveyed in this survey are not paying into the EPF-ETF. In the bigger picture, this to me is one of those real examples of the question of equality under the law, and is an example where a real efforts have to be made on the part of especially government and employers to adhere to the law. I'm going to see if I have any more of these slides. I do. This was the working hours. Okay. So in terms of people's awareness of working hours, about, 50, in this case, 58% weren't aware. A lot of them were working more overtime, and a lot of them are not getting paid for that overtime, to come back to what I said earlier. Those are some of the overall findings of this survey. What I wanted to do is just run through real quickly a few of the remedies that, in consultation with not only the trade union surveyors, various NGOs and trade unions we work with in Sri Lanka, that we thought is important, that are important to highlight. Clearly, trade unions, NGOs, and international development partners can play a pivotal role in sensitizing the government and the business community to comply with national and international labor standards, to which Sri Lanka, as a signatory state of the International Labor Organization, should apply. And clearly, there's a need to raise awareness among workers about what their rights are under the law. I mean, even beyond the idea of establishing relationships with employers to bargain for better conditions, at least understanding what they're entitled to under Sri Lankan law. From our perspective, then, one of the ways to do that, obviously, is support to labor activists, trade unions, to conduct worker outreach, to be able to really connect with workers. I hinted at the difficulty of that before, and especially in the private sector, this was incredibly hindered for obvious reasons by the insecurity during the war and immediately after. That said, I would say that there are cadres and groups of workers in Sri Lanka, especially in the public sector, okay, who, after all, themselves are probably more likely institutionally to be able to avail themselves of these basic labor standards under the law. The health sector, the postal telecom sector, with which the Solidarity Center throughout the war has worked with, both in the North and South, because they had cadres and members in island-wide. So there was still an opportunity, at least through some of that institutional structure, through the public sector unions, to have a presence, to have some education, and these unions could be very useful in terms of this outreach. The International Labor Organization, a number of years ago, promulgated a set of conditions and principles, fundamental rights at work, and what they call a decent work agenda, which sort of defines what decent, quote-unquote, decent work looks like in terms of basic labor standards. And the Sri Lankan government, as an ILO signatory and member organization, member country, should and could sign on to this decent work agenda to promote inclusive growth. And one of the keys to this is looking at economic development as an inclusive process. As we all know, again, around the world, including our own country, we're seeing inequality grow to a tremendous extent. One of the issues that obviously can engender conflict is continued or expanded growth of inequality. So adopting a decent work agenda and a development strategy that addresses both growing the economy but also growing it in an equitable way is going to be really, really important for the Sri Lanka as a country and for the government to adopt this going forward. This includes, as I said, inclusive growth, poverty alleviation, shared prosperity, and basic, minimum standards of living. The Decent Workers Agenda is obligatory for ILO member countries, and this is one of those areas that can actually really address the conflict in a significant way. I think one of the other elements that has emerged, although we didn't focus on it very explicitly in this survey, is when given the sort of wage and hour disparities between men and women workers, trade unions, NGOs, and international development organizations should really pay attention to focusing on gender equity and working with women workers to expand not only their awareness, but also their rights. We have seen when the opportunity arises in different countries where women not only they can emerge as real leaders in the workplace. We have one of those worker leaders with us today, actually, Iza from Indonesia, who is here as a NED fellow, who is a trade union leader who also now works at the Solidarity Center in Indonesia. We've seen this also in Bangladesh, where about 60% of the new unions that have been formed in the last couple of years at the local level are headed by women workers. So there's an opportunity not only for economic advancement, there's an opportunity here for women to emerge as leaders in civil society through their own union organizations. And this addresses, not only we believe in addresses gender equality, but also these issues of discrimination that women workers face, across the board in a lot of different contexts. I'd like to leave it there at this point. We have plenty of time for questions. I think that sort of gives a general overview. We're very pleased that people are interested in the situation of Sri Lanka. It's a small country, but it's important in the context of being able to also help set a standard. And one of the things that I used to hear, and I think this has been, one of the real, how shall I say, poignant, maybe not the right word, but concerning things that I felt certainly about Sri Lanka over the last several years, especially since the end of the war, is when I was our director there between 93 and 97, you look at the UN, human indicators for Sri Lanka as a developing country compared to many, many other countries, literacy, child mortality, all kinds of life expectancy, so much higher than a lot of countries. And people would say to me, we were at the same level of these human indices, not human rights, but human development indices in the early 1950s when South Korea was emerging from the Korean War, and look where we are now. And the other phrase I always heard a lot was, we could become the Singapore of South Asia if it wasn't for this war. Okay, those are kind of, the Singapore of South Asia is an it's a real aspiration. Obviously, the war had a huge impact not only on the economy but the rule of law and issues of conflict in Sri Lanka. The opportunity now, especially I believe with the new government that has emerged, provides civil society, trade unions, the opportunity, especially in the North and East, to really begin to address some of these issues so that as they're building the economy from the ground up at this point, in some respects, the opportunity to get some of these things right and put them in place so that all citizens of Sri Lanka are being able to exercise their labor rights under a consistent set of laws that apply to everybody. So I'd like to leave it at that, and let's have a discussion.
Thank you, Tim. I'd just like to start with a couple of questions for you. We didn't really see much of a breakdown in terms of the informal versus the formal sector, but if you could talk to us a bit about what that looks like in Jaffna, but then maybe more broadly in the North and East, if you have a sense of the breakdowns there, and in terms of not only people's understanding of their rights, but then also as it pertains to gender breakdown.
That's a very good question. The informal economy in this regard incorporates not only workers like domestic workers, but also agricultural workers. We did not go into, and I think this is one of the things that's interesting about trying to look at statistics of sort of more broadly speaking, the North and East, and frankly, at this point, the only institution that has the capability to do that on a really comprehensive way is the state. I believe their last statistics date from 2012. So this is clearly something that needs to be updated. But I would say that in terms of at least those surveyed, the formal sector is in a position to grow compared to the informal sector. The question that I think also, we talked a little bit about this, is how do workers in the informal sector actually, are they able to exercise their rights and protect their rights? That's a real challenge. I would say that there are examples in different countries, to some extent in Sri Lanka, where traditional trade unions, sort of as we think of them as industrial trade union structures around a workplace, are not appropriate for workers in the informal sector. And the Solidarity Center, not only in Asia, but also in other countries, is working with different groups and different workers who are experimenting about how to organize in alternative ways. The domestic worker sector is a particular area which is of interest. The whole move to sort of redefine domestic work as not something sort of off the radar screen, off the stage of national labor laws, and to be valued as real work, has really gained momentum in the last 5 or 6 years. And this is an area that not only the Solidarity Center, but a lot of organizations have worked on in the context of domestic workers who are also migrant workers. In this context, in 2013, I think it was, the ILO passed adopted a new convention, number 189, on the rights of domestic workers. Again, incumbent on member states to recognize domestic workers as workers and to actually afford them protections. In the wake of that, or as a part of that whole process, a whole international domestic workers federation, groups of workers as unions, if you will, across, especially in Africa and also in Asia, has emerged. And some of these groups in Sri Lanka who've been actually basically functioning in other parts of the country. It's an area where they can begin to address this issue of domestic workers in the North and East, which we would be encouraging and seeing how we could assist them with. I don't have a breakdown at this moment in terms of the overall numbers beyond what the government numbers had measured in 2012, which means they probably actually collected the data 2010 and 11, and that was, of course, now we're going back 4 or 5 years. This is going to be something that's really, really important and incumbent on the government to actually be able to document in the next year or so, in order to address the issue and get a better picture and a handle on addressing issues like discrimination against women workers.
Looking at the data, I'm just curious, as you said, maybe because we don't have a complete breakdown of what the formal sector looks like versus the informal sector, and the way that unions go about organizing, I would just be curious about how the Solidarity Center and other institutions similar to the Solidarity Center and your union partners are thinking about changing strategy, or if the data has given you some insight into how to approach this sector differently in the North and East. Has it shed any new light?
That's an interesting question that is also sort of writ large for the Sri Lankan labor movement in general. I'm speaking at least partly now from my own perspective on this. I believe that the unions in Sri Lanka, especially to grapple with new issues in the North and East, many folks who've never been, really, especially when you look at the demographics, the young people that are coming into the workforce, never been exposed to the idea of trade unions and so on before. that the trade union movement has to really update and modernize itself in the way in which they approach workers. We've started an experiment in this regard with not only with regard to workers in sectors in the South, but also migrant workers, through using, social media and so on, which is a way to actually get workers to understand some of the basics. But this is an uphill task. It's a real uphill task. I believe that a number of the trade unions really have to adapt and change their approach to how they think about organizing workers. To be able to address the rights of domestic workers and migrant workers has given them some perspective on how to do this, but I think a lot more work needs to be done. I'm going to use, to be honest, I'll use a domestic example here, and that is if we look at the United States and you look at the labor movement in the United States and the traditional trade union structure, outside that and around that are all kinds of new organizing strategies, especially for migrant workers, that have developed in the U.S. and which are merging with, in this regard, merging with the more established institutional structures such as the AFL-CIO. One really interesting example is the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, because it was based in New York, which has now become the National Taxi Workers Alliance because they have chapters in 3 or 4 other cities, which has a completely different organizing style than pretty much any of the other unions in the AFL-CIO, but are now a member of the AFL-CIO, and Bhairavi Desai, who is the leader of that union, sits on the executive council of the AFL-CIO. The worker centers that are emerging in the south of the United States for migrant workers, and even places like Maryland, Casa, Maryland, are really interesting and innovative ways to organize workers. This is one of the things that we're talking with unions in Sri Lanka about alternative ways to think about organizing workers, especially in an unsettled situation like the Northeast, but we're really at the front end of that.
That's really interesting. Well, I'd like to open it up to the crowd for questions. I apologize in advance for having some AV issues, so we're going to have to, Tim and I can share one mic and we can send the others around. So, anyone has questions?
I'm pretty loud. It's okay, we can do that. Just a couple of questions about the survey itself. Maybe I missed it at the beginning. Just the total number of respondents, the partners that you worked with, were they civil society organizations, were they union shops, were they expert consultants? And then in terms of getting out, did you focus by sector? Did you go out and look for a certain number per sector to ask questions of? That's it.
Those are all good questions. I'm projecting. No, those are all good questions. And there are a couple of minor tweaks we're doing to the written part of this report, which we'll be putting up on our website soon. There were 258 working people in all these different occupations that responded to the survey. This is why we think of it as a sort of as opposed to a super detailed statistical study, is more of a survey. And this was the questionnaire for all of these questions was designed and also implemented by local trade union activists in Jaffna. With the assistance of the Point Pedro Institute of Development, which is a think tank that's based in the north. So that's the basics. We have some more details that will be in the report. In this regard, this partly became, in my view, this is partly a self-selecting survey in the sense that you can approach a worker. I don't know about you, but I have been, and my family have been both on the receiving and the giving end of the phone banking lately. where people will either say, yeah, I don't have the time to talk right now, or yes, I'll answer your questions. So there's a certain, there's a certain willingness of workers to talk to the enumerators. And so in that regard, we also had a larger number in the overall respondents of women as opposed to men in the overall survey.
My question is, okay. My question is about the union picture or profile in Sri Lanka itself, whether it's in the south or north. What's the membership? What is the density in that union, and also what sectors that they are represented in? And then the second one is about the result on the wage disparity between women and men. By what basis or what indicator you can see that there is a disparity? Is it based on the monthly wages only, or on the minimum wage, or is it based on the take-home pay? That's really one that curious me most. Thank you.
Those are both good questions. The density situation in Sri Lanka is very different in the public and the private sector. The public sector has a huge union density, but it's also really fractured. The law, the basic law in Sri Lanka for union formation actually follows, and this has happened throughout South Asia to a certain extent, has followed on former British colonial law, which originally said any 7 people can form a trade union. So you have lots and lots of trade unions, especially in the public sector, that are very segmented. Irrigation officer, 2nd class trade union, 3rd class trade union, office assistant, so within the irrigation department, for example, everybody's unionized, but they're unionized into different units. And so the public sector, including health and telecom, and to the extent that public transport has been privatized, but the density is very high. When it comes to the private sector, outside of the tea estates, outside of the tea industry, which I haven't talked about, it's fairly low. I would have to get back to you on that. I'm not sure what the density level is now, but I would be surprised if it's more than 10 or 11%. In the tea sector, it's much higher, and also divided up among 3 or 4 major unions. In terms of the wage disparity between women and the question of take-home pay, we have a more detailed chart that will be coming out in this report. But generally, what we found was we looked at both women earning in the same profession, the same job that men would be in, and found, not surprisingly, less money for the same job. This has never happened anywhere else. And also, take-home pay then tended to be less. I don't know if there was any other. Sonia and I have been, Sonia Mystery, who also is the senior program officer for the Solidarity Center and covers South Asia, also has been looking at some of this. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Sure. So it's a good question about the take-home pay. When you just look at 8 hours a day of non-overtime for the week, what we found was that based on the survey respondents, that while a smaller percentage of the respondents were men, the men tended to have jobs that were overall higher paying, either in the same sector or they had jobs in sectors that were higher paying. So based on just the survey respondents, the men tended to make more money than the women, either because they were in sectors where they could make more money, or they made more, generally speaking, than women who were working in the same sector. It was not true for every single sector, but that was the general trend. And just to go back to Eric's question for a second, this survey started as something just informal for our office to get a sense of what does the working condition situation look like overall in the north and east, and they focused on Jaffna. And The results were interesting enough that we thought it would be worth, sharing with others, but it was never intended to be a statistically significant, rigorous, survey with a very large sample size. So when we look at the breakdown between even the sectors and the gender breakdown, we're talking about in some sectors where only 5 or 6 people, 5 or 6 respondents worked in the same sector. So it was not statistically significant enough to make, broad claims about wages, but the overall trend was that men either were working in higher wage sectors or were being paid more for the same work.
Do we have other questions?
I can make a comment or two.
Sure. Thank you.
No, I think everybody's hearing me. United States Department of Labor, where I work, we've had I'll call it decent work, but it's promoting further personal contracts at work in Sri Lanka. A project since 2009, it's going to end this year. We're trying to extend it a little bit to accomplish several objectives. But I want to attest to something that you said about women as leaders. And this is something that I've witnessed firsthand. A couple of years ago, we didn't have this. So we were building collective bargaining, negotiating capacity in some factories in the EBZs. And we're also questioning the EBZ model and if it would be appropriate to replicate it in the Northeast or not. But I've seen this where last year we went to one of our facilitation centers, which was something that we designed into the project. Like you talk about unionization in the New York cities and in the South. We thought it was a good idea, I'm working with the ILO on this, to build these facilitation centers within the EBZs so workers can come in and we can do organizing, capacity building, and do different things, not just as hiring, but not successful. No participation. And I'm there thinking, I thought this was going to be a success, That night, I asked Marcus to take me, let's go to the union hall and let's quickly try to get some membership in there so I could talk to them, Overwhelming response. And we found that they didn't want to participate in the facilitation centers because of fear of intimidation or retaliation of participating. But here am I, 11 o'clock at night, with 50 young women who have responsibilities, came out overwhelmingly, and they're responding to our capacity building initiative to become collective bargaining negotiators. So they're actually in the process of negotiating collective bargaining agreements. And we had this sophisticated conversation with them that I was totally stunned at. And this is a year different from an initiative that we had planned to build that capacity. So I just wanted to attest to what you're seeing in Bangladesh as well. We're seeing a lot of women stepping up as leaders in that demographic, that age group, what is it, 25 to 29? That's what I'm talking about. So I'm kind of saddened that our project is coming to an end because we had aspirations for the North and East as well. But a couple other things that I want to see that sort of spins off of what you've been saying. Overwhelmingly, the Employee Provident Fund is a huge violation. Instances of violations for EPF is overwhelmingly disproportionate in terms of the ministries. What we're seeing now, what we've done is we've built a labor inspection, automated labor inspection system that actually is a web-enabled system. So a wage board case that would take 3 months, we do in a week now, because it goes through the chain of command and we could issue violations almost right away. But overwhelmingly, one of the challenges we face is how to reduce that Employee Provident Fund. I mean, recalcitrant employers are hammered in the courts. It takes time. They have to attend these hearings. Why aren't they complying? So we think it's an awareness raising issue with workers as well about their due and getting employers to pay into it. So we have had quite a few challenges and we have done quite a bit. Enforcement is something that we're improving on through the labor inspection system. And I just wanted to add to your remarks a little bit about what we're doing there. The optimism I have comes with some disappointment. but that's normal everywhere. But we're quite optimistic about Sri Lanka becoming a leader in the region for worker rights.
Thank you very much.
Are there other questions?
Tim and Sonia, what are the employment trends in Jaffna? Is unemployment growing about the same? I mean, I know you can collect information on that, but I assume that there's a sense. I mean, are people finding jobs there again?
Yeah, I mean, again, the statistics for this are a few years old because they come from the Sri Lankan government. But interestingly enough, the unemployment rate in Jaffna, again, Jaffna is an urban area, so, you know, obviously as a center, an important city in the north, is actually pretty comparable with the rest of the country. It's not huge. There's not huge unemployment there. I think the areas where you would find, and like again, we looked through a lot of other government statistics when we were looking at this, just as part of our own internal processes, as Sonia was talking about. You definitely have other areas of the north and east that have been conflict areas like Kilinochie and so on, where the unemployment rate is much higher. Jaffna itself as an urban area is comparable with the rest of the country. Now, again, part of that is also, I think, I'm speculating a little bit here, but one is, where can you, for example, grow the tourism industry? Where do you have the infrastructure to be able to put up hotels and so on and so forth? And second, and this is a bigger, I think, longer term, complicated issue that I am no expert on. There might be other people in the room that might be, like our brother Kumar here, I'm not sure, is the land issue, okay? Or Miriam might know something about this, is where, over the years of the Civil War, who has been disenfranchised from their land and who owns title to it. In a place like Jaffna, that might not be as complicated as it might be in some other areas of the north and east. And that is going to have a huge impact on economic development and the ability to, you know, enter into contracts and put up infrastructure and so on.
Just like to note before we move to the next question that we are filming this session and that we will put it up online after. So I just want to let everyone know that as we proceed with the discussion. Other questions? Miriam?
Tim, I think you answered some of the questions that were coming up as you were speaking. You know, in terms of the size of the people that were surveyed, and the fact that it was very much focused just in Jaffna town, is that correct? Yes. Okay. So I was curious to know whether you had kept track of the number of people who perhaps refused to answer or, you know, declined. You know, what was that percentage? I wondered if you had a breakdown ethnically of the people that were surveyed. I'm not as clear in Jaffna, in terms of Jaffna, but the fact of having such a high percentage of women responding, in terms of the North and East, I think there must be a preponderance of women in the population simply as a result of the war. I mean, there are 90,000 women-headed households. So I wonder if that had something to do with it besides perhaps women's willingness to answer the survey. I think perhaps the answer to the unemployment rate being similar to the rest of the country, my question was about you know, opportunities for jobs. Are there lots of opportunities for jobs for people? And then I just make a little comment about the land issue, because there is quite a lot of disenfranchisement from the land And that is the case in Jaffna as well. So I think that very much is a factor. And when you brought up the issue of tourism, that's an area of great concern because, for one thing, and we don't have to go into the whole issue of the still very highly militarized nature of the North and the East, and the fact that the military is involved in many economic issues, we should say, and they in fact also run hotels, and so the hotels are on land that perhaps belongs to other people, so it's not a case of moving out, it's very complicated. And I just wanted to mention that that there is a tourism conference going on right now in the East in Sri Lanka, and the UN is involved in it. And it's all about how tourism development can help with peace and reconciliation. And what we've learned is that the area where it's taking place, the local people were not even aware of this this whole conference. None of them have been consulted. None of them have been invited. The conference material is in Sinhalese, the majority language, and it is written in that material that Sinhalese is the official language, which is, this is one of the problems, and it, the fact that this conference is being labeled peace and reconciliation is just of great concern. So it just seemed a little bit relevant to this conversation.
Those are all really interesting points. Let me see if I can answer a couple of them. And yeah, you're absolutely, those are good questions. I can answer some of that. And you're absolutely right. And about the whole question of how things go forward vis-a-vis not only land, but also the whole question of tourism development. One of the arguments, and this is part of the challenge, and you just identified sort of the gap here, to take this kind of going backwards. One of the, we looked at sort of not only developing organizing drives and work with workers formerly in the tourist sector, in hotels or restaurants, whatever, but also looking at how that economic activity bleeds out into the community. In other words, who's contributing the food, who's contributing the transport, who's going to go to, sort of surround these things. That means that the community has absolutely got to be involved. Ostensibly, the community can benefit from it. I don't even want to get into the environmental issues, because that's a whole other kettle of fish, which I'm not, sort of qualified to talk about. But ostensibly, this should also have knock-on economic activity that's helpful to people in the region. But obviously, there's got to be an engagement with everybody in the community to make these things be equitable and inclusive as economic development. And your point about women-headed households in the North and East, the former conflict areas, is a good point. I don't think we looked at that or parsed that in terms of this particular survey. But it's true, and it's a reasonable assumption that that's part of why our respondents, there were more women than men in the respondents. I'm not sure, I'd have to go back and look at the basic data, whether we have an ethnic breakdown or not. We don't? Okay. And then in terms of non-responsiveness, I think that we found this on different charts or different sort of graphs, different questions would sort of vary depending on, I guess, a variety of factors. I don't know if we have an overall number or an average.
So we didn't track the number of people who didn't want to respond to any of the questions. We only tracked by question how many people did not respond to that particular question.
And so it varies.
Other questions? David?
Tim, thanks for doing this. Two questions. One is on kind of building on some of the points that Marianne was making. Have you noticed a conscious effort on the part of the government and those folks that are involved in the reconciliation process to build workers' rights into that in some way? So is there any piece of workers' rights in the reconciliation process? And then the second question is on the South, the work that Solidarity Center is doing, presumably across the country. Are workers in the South facing the same types of issues, or what sort of things are you hearing about from them in the South with respect to workers' rights?
Those are both really good questions. Our perspective on worker rights formally built into the reconciliation process is we don't see it. It's a very interesting question, because if we go back, say, 5 years, we had conversations with some of our partners in some of the more established trade unions, for instance, some in the healthcare sector, who again have members island-wide, and so they have an interest in, not only, obviously they have membership from all communities. If we go back 5 years, we had a discussion with them about would they be interested in the Solidarity Center supporting a program that identifies and directly addresses and engages with the government specifically on these issues and raising these issues as part of the Truth and Reconciliation process. That was a back and forth discussion that lasted for a little while, and ultimately they decided that would be too high profile at that time to raise in that political atmosphere. They were concerned about retribution and so on. It's worth rehaving that conversation now, because we think, on the basis of this, but also other information and other interactions with different organizations and our unions and partners, that should be part of the conversation. Short answer is no, it's not formally there, but it's something that could be, I think perhaps now, the atmosphere is such that folks might be more willing to address that than they were a few years ago. Are workers in the South and other places facing the same issues? Absolutely. I think that one of the things that Keith alluded to, which I think is very interesting, is there's a very legalistic structure and process that's sort of embedded in industrial relations in Sri Lanka. I think this is partly bureaucratic, just my speculation, partly bureaucratic, partly coming out of the whole British law tradition, where on one level, people want to place confidence in, okay, if we take this to court, we argue our case, the merits of our case, we'll win the case, and so on. So there's a lot of legal, sort of wrangling that goes on between unions and employers over these things, which draw out these enforcement of various laws, like application of the EPF, ETF, which is in the interest of employers because ultimately it's less expensive to them, but it's really hard for the unions to maintain that. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I've noticed this over the last 20 years and trying to figure out, like, how do you streamline that? How do you address and try to, get a situation solved at the local level before it has to get dragged into a big legalistic process? So this is a big challenge in Sri Lanka. Frankly speaking, this is one of the things we're trying to do with our partners in Burma now, is they're just setting up their whole new industrial relations system, is let's try to focus on getting this solved at the local level instead of dragging it out into a big, legal battle. That tradition, however, the legal tradition, very, very strong in Sri Lanka, so I wouldn't be willing to say that you could get a fresh start, quote unquote, from zero in that sense, in the North and East. Obviously, it'd be encouraging employers who are setting up new enterprises, and new facilities to try to put in place good industrial relations from the start, and that's certainly one of the messages that we're trying to give to the business community also.
Speaking of big legal issues that are being dealt with nationally, obviously the constitutional reform process is happening as well. Is there anything with respect to workers' rights that folks are advocating for, or is that a separate conversation that's dealt with in different legislation?
I would say I'm not a legal expert on the Sri Lanka situation. I would say that's dealt with not particularly in the Constitution beyond some of the original sort of fundamental rights language that was there in the Constitution from years before that unions will want to retain. That language has tended to be aspirational and not particularly applicable, so that pretty much all the rest of these issues and specific application of rights and standards tends to fall under other legislation and regulations that have to be implemented and enforced.
If I could actually just go back to the last question you answered about the EPF, ETF. Obviously that's an area, a challenge in terms of enforcement. I know you didn't look at this in this survey, but just curious, looking at the work that you all have been doing both in the South and the North and East, what other areas are there that the legal regime isn't necessarily being, the most common areas where the legal regime isn't being implemented in terms of gaps? And do you see a disparity between the North and the South on those particular issues?
You know, that's a really good question. I have to be honest and say that I, at this moment, don't have a real perspective on that. I think one of the things we'd like to do next is really make that comparison. This was sort of a first step in terms of gathering, okay, let's see what we understand about geographically what's happening, say, in Jaffna. Probably what's useful is to maybe think about looking at some particular industries or particular sectors of the economy and measure that across island-wide, north and south. And so that's one of the areas that we're starting to look at possibly for a future study, because then you get more of an apples to apples kind of comparison. The one thing I will say, though, is that this gets back also to sort of the basic rule of law question. Again, I'm going back and sort of accumulating my observations over the last, 3, 4, 5 years, going both to, when I lived in Sri Lanka, we were able to go to the east, but not the north at that time. So, when the ceasefire came in like 2002, started to be able to make some contacts there. But then, of course, after 2009, a lot more communication back and forth. And what we found, even after the war was over, in the public sector, so ostensibly, the government's your employer, whether you're in the postal telecom sector, or you're the health service, nurses association, doctors, whatever. What we found was grievances sort of across the board between those workers and members of those unions in the north compared to the south. In other words, just basic resources to be able to do their job. Even under that circumstance, within the public sector, under the government's umbrella, that discrimination was continuing to go on. I don't have any evidence that that's really changed. So in looking at particular sectors, I think we're going to get more information about some of these specifics and to be able to make a better or more complete sort of comparison.
Other questions? Tissa?
Two questions. The first is now where the Sri Lanka government, the US government and Sri Lanka have a relationship where there is a GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, that is applied to Sri Lanka. And as far as I know, labor standards is one of the issues that is measured in giving a country GSP. So will you, in what way do you think your report will sort of influence, or at least influence the decisions that the US government is now implementing, the US policy that is now being implemented on GSP. That's one question. The other is that, well, as Miriam was saying, there is a militarization that is going on in the north right now. And that is not helping people who feel that they have to deal with superior in a situation where they can be cowed down or where they can't exercise their rights in the way they want. But at the same time, and this is my question, we also know that in many of these industries and things that have begun in Northern Sri Lanka, it is people from outside the north, that is mostly similar entrepreneurs, who have invested in hotels, in some of the garment sectors and so on and so forth. Now we also know that these people are supported by the military. And there is an informal relationship that is between the military and these industrial, the leaders of industries that are operating industries in the north end. So in that kind of an environment, without changing the environment, how do you think like a worker will summon up enough courage to go and speak about his rights and say, look, you're not giving me my dues? So how do you think your work could sort of help that sort of situation to return, where people feel more confident to speak with their employers? Okay.
That's a really, really good question. Let me go with question 2 and then question 1. That's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge, and getting back to also what Miriam said, and you referred to that, was the continued militarization or role of the military in economic activity. I'll be very frank with you. I think it's pretty difficult for NGOs, activists, trade unionists to address that structural issue. There may be levers and ways to do that, and that will bring me to GSP in just a moment. There may be levers and ways to address that. I think it's beyond the capacity of the trade union movement in Sri Lanka to really sort of get at that element of economic development. This is probably why it's very, very important, sort of maybe, vaguely analogous to what the US government has done in Burma over the years, is to take a look at who's doing the investment, and if not to sanction, at least to make people aware of who's behind this economic, this economic activity or this particular project or whatever. Certainly advocacy on the part of anti-corruption and other human rights activists in Sri Lanka can highlight that. It does definitely raise the question of how does a group of individual workers in a situation like that, in an enterprise like that, raise their voice to try to organize for their rights. I don't really have an easy answer for you. I think it's very difficult. But the watchdog opportunity, or the watchdog groups that exist in Sri Lanka, to the extent they feel like they can do it, are going to be very important in terms of trying to highlight these issues. I don't have an easy remedy. I will say on the GSP, the General License and Preferences, everybody doesn't know it's a U.S. trade law that also has labor elements in it. Recipient countries should abide by a whole set of standards, including basic core labor standards, in order to get these facilities for reduced trade benefits. Over the years, Sri Lanka has been subject to petitions with the U.S. Trade Representative to remove those benefits. The last review on this, and Keith would probably remember this better than I do, was Right, 2012 was
Reinstated.
right. Yeah, it was the latest petition was they basically said okay, the review was finished. From the perspective of the Solidarity Center, the AFL-CIO in the past has been the organization in the American labor movement, in addition to some other activist NGOs in the U.S. that have filed petitions to remove GSP benefits from Sri Lanka. Our rule of thumb as the American labor movement in this regard is we never encourage the filing of a petition by the AFL-CIO unless partners in the particular country, in this case in Sri Lanka, agree to this, ask for this, and feel it's a useful tool. At this moment, a petition isn't being considered right now and hasn't been asked for specifically by any of our partner organizations there. Not to say it couldn't happen in future, but I will also, and cognizant that there are folks from the U.S. government in the room, I will be very honest and say there are lots of considerations that go into granting or suspending the GSP for different countries. And I think that in the case of Sri Lanka right now, I think there's a real will and interest by the U.S. government to see this new government succeed. And I think the U.S. Trade Representative has the option to either accept or not accept a petition for review. I suspect that if a petition were filed by anybody in particular at this time, it might not be accepted.
Just to go back to that second question about what role can the unions play, what is standardly true across the world is any one worker, any couple of workers standing up for their rights or trying to advocate for their rights by themselves puts them in a great deal of danger for losing their jobs or being punished in some way, which is why workers try to organize a union, right? Because it has legal protections. One of the things that unions in Sri Lanka have been able to do, like in the tourism sector specifically, is organizing hotels, for example, that are part of the same chain. So it's not, advances made through collective bargaining are going to be far more beneficial for all workers working in that hotel chain the more that they're able to organize. So then it's not just a lone hotel in Jaffna, but then it's a hotel that's part of a chain, and that chain has maybe 5 other hotels organized in other parts of the country. So when that union is negotiating with the common employer, there's a greater chance that those benefits will be available then to all of those organized workers. So that's one of the benefits that having an island-wide union really presents for workers. The other piece of it too is that when we're talking about all the workers in the informal economy, then we're not talking about the same powerful industrialists when you're talking about domestic workers. There's a different kind of organizing, a different kind of awareness raising. So there are definitely organizing benefits that workers can achieve, even if tomorrow they're not going to change the entire structural system. There are definitely benefits to be had from organizing.
Can I make a comment about that, Simon? One of the issues that we have about an individual worker filing a complaint and being struck down that we built into our electronic data collection system is holding the ministry accountable for when a complaint comes in, that it doesn't disappear. Once that complaint enters the system, we put a clock on it, and we have a digital record of that complaint coming in, whether it was by mail, by hand, through the Prime Minister's office, through a phone call. We have all those categories tracked. So it could be an anonymous complaint coming in. The idea is that we have to hold a regional labor inspector, commissioner accountable for these complaints coming and they don't disappear. So it stays in the system and it tracks it. So it's an accountability measure that we've built into the electronic system to see what the final disposition is of that complaint within a period of time. And the reports that we print periodically will show what is coming in, and how it's being dispositioned. So it's an accountability approach that we're holding in ministry to for individual, not just individual worker complaints, but it gives the worker a voice, and we're going to keep track of what happens to that complaint.
And you'll also entertain anonymous complaints, right?
Yes, we're trying to institute that. There'll be challenges in the north as well. There are new challenges in the north, but we do institute it in the south with the new system.
Thank you for that. I'm actually curious if you got into this in the survey or in the future, might be interesting to look at people's awareness about redress mechanisms and where they can actually go to complain about these things. I would imagine that the numbers would actually be quite low in light of the data you presented, but curious if you have anything to say about that, as well as EU GSP, I'm curious about.
Yeah, those are both good questions. You know, this is an area, to be honest, that I'm not an expert on. I think there are probably folks who have looked at how the reinstitution of the sort of legal infrastructure of the state, you know, courts, systems, and so on, have been set up, regenerated, or to what extent they're happening in the Northeast. I don't know the answer to that question. That's an interesting question, though. That's really important because to the extent that somebody is going to be able to use a mechanism, it has to exist. And so that's a real, I think that's something that's, I think, really important for folks who are focused on the rule of law and building that capacity, really important to focus on. In regard, what was your second question? EU GSP, right? That was really interesting. So the European Union's GSP law actually has some additional elements to it that the American GSP does not. It has a broader set of conditions they call EU GSP Plus that includes other human rights issues. And actually, as a result of the situation at the end of the war in Sri Lanka, EU GSP was actually removed at that time. As I recall, one of the estimates, the impact of the economy was something like $1.2 billion, so it had a significant impact. Subsequently, my understanding is that EU GSP has been reinstated after the new government has come into place. It hasn't? Okay, please, yeah. They were considering it, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's a big issue for the government that they want it back.
Right.
And there have been a lot of discussions about it. However, the way the EU explained it at the time was, when they took it away, is, you know, in order to get this and in order to keep it, countries have to meet conditions. It's just as simple as that. So the question is, does the country now meet those conditions? Now, a number of EU countries are kind of pushing to help them get it back, particularly Germany. But at the moment, they don't have it back. And I have not been following enough to know whether, you know, these conditions have actually been met. The most recent information I saw is that there, and I don't understand it, I would need someone who's following it to explain it, but that there were a number of conditions, which numbered almost like 100, and that through negotiations that those conditions have now been reduced to 15. So what does that mean? I mean, if you've got contracts and you've got conditions, so I don't know exactly what that means, but it's something that the government very much wants, that some EU members are pushing, but it's not yet.
I think about a year ago, it was being debated fiercely when the United Nations Human Rights Commission had a case with Sri Lanka. It's about exactly a year, close to a year, where a lot of human rights issues were in that list of conditions that and these are conflict-related human rights issues that were unresolved at the time. But as far as I know, that resolution was tabled and I think resolved. So I'm just adding to the conversation. No, they haven't reinstated it, but I don't know what the conditions that are outstanding are.
But militarization and land issues were some of the conditions. A little bit.
Possibly ongoing torture, might have something.
Yeah, I think usually as far as the GSP in the European Union GSP is concerned, there are four major areas. One is labor, the other is human rights, environment, and something else is dealing with right now. And as it is, as you were saying about the US, I think in the European Union as well, there is a huge political will to kind of work with this government, with the government of Sri Lanka. And there are people who are trying to push the European Union to reinstate this GSP plus. I think that's the conflict that is taking place, but as far as I know, it's still not resolved and it's still going on, the debate is still going on.
Yeah, I stand corrected. I knew that this was going on. I wasn't sure if it already had been resolved. So, because the previous government, sort of in defiance, said we don't care if we've lost a huge GSP. Clearly, it's if you're losing $1.2 billion, it's in your interest to find a way to resolve that.
Other questions?
And I think that is one of the reasons why the economic processing zones have much fewer people, I mean much fewer workers now, because many of the factories that were operating in the economic processing zone had to close because the GSP plus was withdrawn. So that might be also one of the reasons why you were saying there are now just 85,000 rather than 300,000 before.
Do we have other questions?
If I could, maybe I have one more, since
Okay.
we have a touch of time. One last question as it relates to regional relationships, and just generally in terms of those types of international solidarity relationships across unions. India is Sri Lanka's greatest trading partner, is increasing its investments in Sri Lanka. What type of relationships do we see between Indian unions and those in Sri Lanka, and efforts to not just build solidarity, but to see worker rights being promoted?
That's a really good question. Unfortunately, as you said, we have a little bit of time left, so we should be done by like 2 o'clock. Okay. This is a really interesting question. There are certain areas of cooperation sort of regionally, one of which there actually is an organization that mirrors the SARC, the governments of the region, called the South Asian Regional Trade Union Congress, I guess it is, SARTUC, which had been a sort of a moribund organization for a number of years, but in the last 2 or 3 years in particular has really sort of re-energized around the idea of building common cause among the trade unions and the activists in the region on migrant workers. This has sort of moved down the track in terms of higher and higher sort of awareness in the public sphere, not just obviously in South Asia in relation to what's going on in the Gulf countries, for example, although that's part of it. Again, this effort has also been boosted in part by headlines about what happens to migrant workers who wind up, in mass graves in Thailand or Malaysia, or the incredible exodus that's going on in the Mediterranean and into Europe. This has raised the profile and the issue for folks all over the world, and has also given some more impetus to the trade unions and labor activists in South Asia to try to work together. Now, without going into a history lesson of the Indian trade union movement, which would take us till 2 o'clock for sure, what's been really interesting in terms of what's happened in India to the trade union movement over the last 20 years has been a real decentralization, and coming out of sort of colonial period, the anti-imperialist struggle against the British, with trade unions along with other various mass civil society groups as engines of that anti-imperialist move, they wound up being sort of affiliated with different parties, whether it's the Congress Party or now the Bharat Mazdoor, party, Modi's party, various Mazdor's work, BJP, Janata Dal, which fell apart, sort of, as a leftist group, the Communist Party, and so on. Really, in the last 20 years, all of the action, so much of the action from the national level of all of these Indian trade unions has devolved down into the states. And so you have all of, trade union centers and all kinds of work going on in all these different states, and independents who have come up that are not part of any of this other traditional structure whatsoever. So it's super fragmented. It's very, very difficult for any of the unions, even in India, to get together on certain issues. And as such, you would think that on some level there's an opportunity to build some common cause on various issues across just the country, not even to speak of the region. It's been very, very difficult, and just the sort of demographic and the political trends in India have led to this real sort of dissolution of power. There are lots of powerful local unions, but it doesn't really translate into a national effort or a national sensibility the way it did a number of years ago.
Well, thank you, Tim, for walking us through the survey, and to all of you for this really great discussion. And with that, we will wrap it up.